Every so often I like to dig up drivers from yesteryear and try to figure out a few things, like were they better than we thought they were, worse than we ever thought they were, or were they just okay and not able to achieve their full potential through circumstance or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And over the course of this little series, if you want to call it that, I've looked at the likes of David Coulthard, Jarno Trulli and Giancarlo Fisichella. Drivers who did okay but didn't really have much in return. Coulthard had the opportunity in good cars, but his teammates were Mika Hakkinen and Kimi Räikkönen, and the guy in the other car happened to be Schumacher, as well as having the arrival of Montoya and the emergence of Alonso to deal with. And I've also looked at Jackie Ickx, too young to be in with the likes of Stewart and those guys who emerged in the mid-1960s, and too old to be in with the next generation of talent like Francois Sever. But the thing is, stats don't necessarily tell the full story, because what might look like a bad season on the wiki stat sheets might be an issue with a badly built car rather than a skill issue. Sometimes you have to go below the surface to see what's really going on. As already mentioned, you could easily be in the right place at the right time, but you might have the two generational talents alongside you or in the other car, like Coulthard did. As already mentioned, you might easily be in the right place at the right time, but you might have the two generational talents alongside you or in the other car, just like Coulthard did. And no matter what Coulthard is going to be able to do with his talent levels, the other two are just going to make him look bad, simply because they were just, well, much better. See also Valtteri Bottas. But the one I thought I'd look at today is a driver who I think gets a bit of a bad rap, simply because there's a lot of things that people don't realise, well, happened. And that driver is Damon Hill. Now please do hear me out on this one, because I think you might learn something and you might realise something. And that's not a dig at you, by the way. This is stuff that I've been looking at and just think that you might find interesting. Damon Graham Devereaux Hill. What a name! Born in 1960 to Betty and Graham, Damon grew up in a racing family. His mum and dad had met at the London Rowing Club, and Graham went on to become one of the greatest drivers of his generation, if not of all time. The man is the only car racer in the history of car racing to win the Triple Crown: Monaco, Indianapolis and Le Mans, or the Formula One World Championship, Indianapolis and Le Mans. Either way, Graham is the only person to do it, winning the Formula One Championship twice, and Monaco a then record-breaking 5 times, a statistic tied with Schumacher and only bettered by Senna. But Graham is the original Mr. Monaco. 14 wins is easily attainable these days, but back then it was a highly respectable number, reached over a period between 1958 and 1975. And before you start thinking, well, that's a long time to only win 14 wins if you're one of the greatest ever racing drivers, but this was a period where the Formula One seasons only had between 8 and 11 races per season, which sounds utterly ludicrous given that we're on 24 now. And the reliability was much worse in those days, especially when he drove for BRM, because that team was a meme more than Lotus was when it came to breaking down. They weren't called bloody rubbish motors for nothing. For every season that Kimi Antonelli completes starting from 2025, that's equivalent to around 2 3/4 for Graham. When it comes to the likes of Graham Hill, Jim Clark and Fangio and Ascari and guys like that, we almost have to talk about their statistics almost like we talk about dog years relative to human years. So where does 14 wins put Graham then? Well, if you look at his contemporaries and the guys who came before him, he's tied with Jack Brabham, and he has more wins than Ascari, Andretti, Hulme and Ickx. Stewart, Moss, Fangio and Clark have more, and Stewart and Clark are still in the top 10 when it comes to the all-time list. But not only was Graham pretty handy behind the wheel of a racing car, he was also in high demand as a television personality, and it's a job he would have probably walked into after he was done in racing, because he possessed an incredibly dry, sarcastic wit and was just a natural entertainer. He was in with the royal family in Monaco and would often be seen chatting at women at every Grand Prix. As well as this, parties at the Hill family home in Mill Hill near Barnet were frequent, and the rich and famous of the time would often be seen there. But in November 1975, everything changed. Flying back from a test session at Paul Ricard with the Embassy Hill Formula One team, Graham was at the controls of a Piper Aztec when it crashed on a golf course on approach to Elstree Airfield. Basically, Graham had tried to land at an airfield that was only equipped for visual landings in conditions that would have required the use of instruments. And because his IMC rating, which is basically the license that allows him to legally fly in those conditions, had expired, and to make matters worse, the license that had been issued to him by the FAA in the United States had also expired, along with the fact that when the plane was bought, it was not registered in the UK. So this plane, by the letter of the law, didn't exist. It was unregistered and it was stateless. And because of that fact, and the fact that all the insurances were then invalidated because of all the licenses and qualifications expiring, the Hill family lost everything as they paid out on the different lawsuits and everything else that came with the death of Graham. And because Graham was no longer around to earn money, well, they lost everything. And I've told the full story about that plane crash before. It's an interesting story, and it seems that a lot of people seem to like aviation and racing. But either way, this leads us back to Damon. At the time, he had not long turned 15 and now had to go through the rest of his teenage years without his dad, and the life of the family in complete turmoil. I've also looked at the end of Damon's time in Formula 1, detailing his drop-off after his 1996 championship win. But this is more to do with how he got there in the first place and how well he did, considering one thing that will come clear later on. Because of the reduced circumstances the family lived in, Damon started working as a labourer and a motorcycle courier to help support himself and the family once he left school. And one of his motorcycle jobs was ferrying my local paper, the Express and Star, from the printers in London up to Walsall. Not exactly the sort of job that people would expect him to be doing. This was the son of Graham Hill, How the Mighty Have Fallen, and so on. But in 1979, just 4 years after his dad was killed, Damon was given the green light to race motorbikes by his mother, and was also determined to stick 2 fingers up to his headmaster from school, because that headmaster had told him not to waste his education on racing, because, well, sticking 2 fingers up to authority is exactly what an 18-year-old boy would do. The plan was, get on the motorbikes, race them, and become the next Barry Sheen. That was the dream. His mother even managed to get in contact with Dan Gurney, an old racing colleague of Graham's in California, to see if Damon could learn some bits and pieces. But cars were just never on the radar. Just motorbikes. When he got back from California, it was back to the labourer work, renovating old Victorian houses in London. And it was actually something he loved doing, and it allowed him to forget what had happened to his dad. But 1981, though, is where the motorcycle racing properly started. The now 20-year-old Hill funded his career through the labourer work that he was doing and managed to find some local sponsorship in Watford. He won a single 350cc race on a Kawasaki thing. What does that say? A Z500. Whatever one of those is. But anyway, a little later on, when he became a motorcycle dispatch rider, he was sponsored by the company, which was called Apollo, and was able to get a TXZ 350. Nice. I think. Is that good or bad? But there was one small issue, and that was mother. Betty had watched Graham race for so long and survive where others, including his best friend and teammate, had not been so lucky in 1968. And then Graham had survived a massive shunt of his own in 1969, so motorcycle racing was just too much for her to bear. Her husband was gone in an accident, and she didn't want to see her only son go the same way. It was made even more harrowing when Damon and the other riders in these motorcycle races had to wear dog tags with their names, addresses and blood types on them, just in case they weren't in any state to explain to the local NHS staff if they ended up being peeled off the tyre barrier. This was all stuff you'd expect to see in a war zone. But in 1984, Damon embarked on a journey that he had absolutely no interest in starting. The Winfield Racing School in France was, at the time, a breeding ground for French talent. It was run by an Englishman, and there'd been no proper British talent emerging from it. After a conversation with Betty, Damon was offered a free place at the school just to see how he'd get on, and to see if it would coax him away from racing bikes. Despite having never stepped into a kart and his only racing been on bikes simply because he wanted to, Damon showed above average aptitude for driving a car. Perhaps talent is genetic after all. And Damon made it through to the final race they had there, but he bottled a couple of gear changes, so he lost out. Soon after, word got out that Graham Hill's lad was racing cars. So Damon's first ever car race was going to start in the spring of 1984 at Brands Hatch, and this is where I bring in that thing that I mentioned before where I said things might come clear a little bit later on. Damon was 23 years old at this point and is about to start his first ever car race at the age of 23. Senna was born in the same year, 1960, there's only months in between the two of them. And Senna, at the age of 23, is about to start racing in Formula 1 for Tolman. So one is about to start in Formula 1 and the other is about to start racing, which is mental to think about. By the same token, by the age of 23, Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton were both Formula 1 champions. But it was only sporadic appearances through that year, money being the big issue, and there was a cavalcade of media there simply because it's Graham Hill's son racing. And given the media interest, Damon was given a little more leeway than others when it came to getting on the grid. But just because he was Graham's son didn't mean that sponsorship was easy to get. Most thought the name wasn't worth taking a punt on just because of his name, and there was the fact that he was 23, that wasn't helping either. But he managed to get some sporadic racing done at this point. In 1985, he did a full season in Formula Ford and managed to finish third at the Formula Ford Festival, which isn't bad, all things considered. That's quite the prestigious championship to be a part of. 1986 involved borrowing $100,000 through Cellnet, a phone company, and was holding steady there for that whole season, and he managed to get his first wins in 1987 and 1988. But the death of his West Surrey racing teammate Bertrand Fabi made him more determined to race cars, because he didn't want, in his own words, to reach the age of 60 and feel like he had done nothing with his life. He's 65 this year. For 1989 and 1990, he and Perry McCarthy were evenly matched for a spot at the Down on Its Luck Mooncraft team, but the sponsors wanted the Hill name. But despite a few poles and leading some races, no wins came. For 1991 though, the breakthrough into Formula 1. Sort of. During 1990, Mark Blundell was the Williams test driver, and he had managed to get himself a drive with Brabham while also getting on the books at McLaren doing some work over there. Mark and Damon had become mates in this time, and it was something to go for, even if being a test driver in those days was an okay payday, but at the same time, a career staller. If you could break out, brilliant, do it, take whatever drive you can get at a team, even if it's someone like Brabham who were, well, about to go bust. But if you couldn't break out of your test driver role, you were stuck because you were, well, just a test driver. Damon's F3000 team in 1990, Middlebridge, had just bought the Brabham team, which was seen as being a bit weird, but it would actually help Damon get onto an F1 grid. He had landed the Williams test driver role while driving for Eddie Jordan in Formula 3000 in 1991, so that was money to support him, his wife, and 2 kids. And when Giovanna Amati's money didn't materialise in 1992, Brabham said, "Hey, you want a run?" Damon got the drive for the Spanish Grand Prix up to the Hungarian Grand Prix of 1992, only qualifying for 2 races. He finished 16th at Silverstone and then 11th at Hungary, after which the Brabham team folded for good. But at least there was still the Williams test role for something to do in the interim. But he got some more luck, because Riccardo Patrese was going to be leaving Williams, thinking that Prost's arrival would mean he'd be off anyway, and Mansell then quit because he didn't want to have Prost as a teammate. So the natural progression for Williams was to promote Hill. He did know the car after all. So for 1993, a 32-year-old Damon Hill made it to a Formula 1 grid. Properly this time. With the FW15C, he'd win 3 races at the Hungaroring, Spa and Monza, and also got a smattering of podiums, with Japan being the only race he finished that year where he didn't finish on the podium. Considering his age and only having stepped into a racing car just 9 years prior, he'd done alright. But in 1994 he had to take a massive step up. It was a season that eerily mirrored the 1968 season, which also involved a Hill. Graham. Ayrton Senna was hired to replace the outgoing Prost, and Damon was kept on. Senna would then be killed at the San Marino Grand Prix, and Damon, much like Graham had to when Clark was killed, had to lift the team up like Graham did with Lotus. Williams managed to rescue their poor start to the season and managed to win the Constructors' Championship, but just missed out on the drivers following that collision at Adelaide. But, let's be honest, they were helped by Michael's disqualifications and bans, but that season was just mental all round. I need to do that last race of 1994 actually. In 1995, Williams and Hill had an absolute mare. Strategy calls were all over the place, and Damon crashing into Michael didn't help matters either, and the press were on his back. But then in 1996, he finally did it. Damon Hill won the World Championship. Although it wasn't exactly easy, after dominating the early part of the season, Hill could have won the championship at Monza had he won that race, but a case of driver error let him down as he clanged those tyre stacks the FIA had installed at the chicanes to stop the cars taking liberties with the flat curbs. But at the Japanese Grand Prix, Hill finally won the championship, being the first son of a world champion to win the title, and in his own words, rescued the Hill family name after that foggy night in 1975. So it begs the question then, what makes me think that he gets a bad rap? Well, other than British bias, obviously. Like I already mentioned, Damon didn't start in karts like everybody else. Out of his generation, so that's Brundle, Senna and guys like that, born up to about 64 or so, Damon was the only one not starting in karts or otherwise started racing early. He had no intention of ever racing, even when his dad was alive, and he kind of just fell into it through his dad's death. And I just need to repeat the fact that Damon didn't start racing cars properly until 1984 or 1985. Brundle and Senna had made it to Formula 1 by that point and had been racing for much longer still because of karts and junior formula and all of that stuff. Everybody around his age had over a decade of experience on him. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that he was as good as Schumacher or Senna, or even Beloff, who was 3 years older. But Damon could show what he was capable of at races like Brazil 1996 and Japan 1994, which was probably his best drive, and managed to beat Schumacher on merit at a race when Michael might have been heavily favoured because, well, Michael Schumacher is the Rainmaster. But while Schumacher is, 9 years younger, and they both started in Formula 1 12 months apart from each other, Michael had way more experience. And there's going to be those who say Newey Merchant or put my granny in that Williams and she wins the title, but not even Alain Prost could dominate the season in that FW15C. But I guess it depends on who your favourite drivers are. If your favourite driver dominates in an overpowered car, then it's talent. If it's somebody you don't like that much, then it's the car. It's just one of those things. And yes, of course, there is going to be some pro-Hill bias here, but like the man himself said in regards to the Brazilian Grand Prix of last year, you give credit where it's due, but at the same time, you give criticism where it's due. 1995 was a complete and utter screw-up. 1994 he went for the gap not knowing Michael was driving a wounded car, and so on. But you can't deny that the performance in that Arrows in 1997 at Hungary or that performance at Suzuka 1994 are top tier drives. Maybe he hadn't had the time to get those kinds of chokes out of his system. Damon Hill is Nathan Fillion in The Rookie. He had to learn twice as fast and 3 times as hard. In a Formula 1 career that lasted between 1992 and 1999, he managed to get quite a bit done, it has to be said. Not many people get their breaks in a sport they had no intention of entering at the age of 32 and then go on to win a championship. Okay, luck with the car helps, but you need the talent at the same time. Not many of us could just jump into a car at the age of 24 and make it to the same position. But it does make you wonder, what if he had started racing at the same time as Senna and Schumacher and Brundle and Beloff? How much further would he have got? Answers on a postcard. So then, a look at how Damon Hill made it to Formula 1 and how he did alright considering how late he started racing. If this has been interesting for you, then do like the video so I know I did a good job, and for more from this channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help with the picture purchasing piggy bank and that sort of thing, there is a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, the super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.